Welcome, everybody, to another episode of Real Cannabis. I know you're going to love this one. This is a conversation that I've been waiting to have for a while. Now, I met our guest today on his podcast, which is on the Craft Growers Network, and it is called The Way We Grow. I love what he is doing with the show, what the theme of it is, because it aligns with a lot of what I do. It aligns with a lot of what you guys are doing, but he also has some really wicked, awesome background with commercial cannabis as well. So I'm stoked to kind of get to talk to him about home grow, the journey, commercial, and maybe even a little bit of tissue culture. So let me bring our guest in today, Mr. Nick Wolfe. How are you doing?
Hey, Chad. I'm doing well. Thanks for having me today.
Yeah, absolutely. My pleasure. We met, months ago. I think I was actually the first episode
You
of The
were.
Way We Grow. Yay! And how has that been going for you? I think you guys are up to 17 or 18 episodes now.
Yeah, 17 episodes so far and still just booking more guests. It does kind of get tedious at points to try and find guests to come on every week. And I try to record at least one episode a week, but sometimes I'll record a couple a week and sometimes I'll skip a couple weeks because I also am, managing this cultivation facility and doing a whole bunch of other stuff on the side. And so it's a busy life of a cannabis individual.
Absolutely is. And scheduling, like podcasts can be really hard, especially when they're all, if you're trying to do them all live, your guest has to also fit into your schedule. And as growers, we have some pretty busy and sometimes wacky hours.
Yeah.
So I understand the struggle. One a week is man, after doing this for many years, one a week is really hard. I try to
Yeah.
go 2 a week, but I get overexcited and sometimes it's more than that. But people want to hear about the cannabis journey. So let's get to that. So maybe what was kind of the inspiration behind the show? Or can you maybe tell people a little bit more about your show? Because I really like the premise that you're doing. And again, the diversity of guests too. Like that has been enjoyable. So tell us a little bit about the show and what the goal is there.
For sure. Well, I guess the show kind of was inspired because I pivoted out of the culinary industry in 2020 when COVID happened. And I was trying to figure out what I wanted to do. And cannabis was it was the best option for me living in Oregon, being something that was still deemed an essential worker. It was, I know, right? That's the funny thing. But hey, people need their
Me
medicine.
too. Yeah, me too. I had to keep working,
Yeah.
but I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, that's all good. It's a funny thing to think about and look back on. But I found work at a farm, and it was kind of entry level grunt work. My my status as like a sous chef or whatever at these really well known restaurants didn't matter at that point, and so it was. Grunt work of just watering a bunch of plants by hand. They had a large outdoor canopy that we were just watering through the summer by hand every day. And it was a really interesting experience. And, it was probably 6 to 7 hours of that every day, 5 days a week. So I would just listen to podcasts all day. And I started listening to a bunch of cannabis podcasts. Like I think Growcast was one of the first ones that I started listening to, and then the Growing with My Fellow Growers show. And I really liked how they were trying to help provide as much information as possible to people in both of those shows, right? So like with Growcast always having a new guest on to talk about something cannabis related, or with the Growing with My Fellow Growers, where it's a panel of growers always bringing up a subject for the week kind of, and talking about their own grows and their own experience, and providing that anecdotal evidence was, I thought, really helpful, because I can parse through anecdotal evidence and then use it to cross-reference what I'm reading online and in books, and kind of piece together a solid foundation for knowledge, and it worked really well with cannabis. And so I was able to use that then to kind of increase my knowledge and my, I guess, worth to these different cannabis companies that I've worked for. And I thought that there was still something missing in those podcasts for me, where it seemed as though there was a lot of, there's a lot of encampments in cannabis, whether
Yes.
you're organic or salt based or all home grow, or, I only buy stuff at the dispensary, like there's all these different trains of thought of how you're going to get your cannabis that you want. And I wanted to kind of expand that and open it up a form of communication that just allowed people to talk about their cannabis journey and why they're into it and what they're about, but really focused on cultivation. Because,
Mhm.
you know, uh, the dispensaries and the kind of peripheries that aren't necessarily involved with the actual grow of cannabis, but are still involved with the distribution or the packaging or whatever, whatever is like ancillary to the actual growing of the plant, doesn't interest me as much as growing the plant, because that's just the best part of it to me. And I feel like it's a lot of unsung heroes in the grow space that are uh, pushing the boundaries of quality and yields and new and interesting terpene profiles and cannabinoid profiles. I mean, that all starts with the growers following or chasing something that they want.
It really does, because I like to experiment with the cultivars that I'm familiar with here, the ones that I work with, and I'll grow it great, but I'll also grow some just like really bad intentionally, just to kind of see kind of what happens and do this and that. But in regards to the terpene profile, it's the same plant. It's the clone from the same mother, and I could treat it two different ways. And while the terpene profile remains true throughout, there's different levels of it.
Sure.
And getting to grow it, when you grow something very well, it's allowed to express its maximum potential. So being able to do that is very important, and that does start on the cultivation side.
Hmm.
When you came into this industry, as far as shifting from the culinary work into cannabis, you entered where everybody has to enter.
Yeah.
And it's like, regardless of your experience, and just speaking from that perspective, it's like, don't really care how smart you are, don't really care how much you've been doing, you're gonna
Yeah.
be watering. And it's crazy to think, for some people, he watered for 6-7 hours a day. I'm like, yeah, dude, you fill up those 250-gallon IBCs, you roll them out, you finish one off, you grab the next one.
Yep.
Big, big, big warehouse. I'm used to the warehouse. I've not done the outdoor stuff, but
For sure.
that kind of leads me to another thing that I've really enjoyed about watching your shows is your your intelligence and your experience comes through. And I think that's a very good um, attribute to have when talking with the guests, because you're able to relate, you're able to ask good questions. I'm a big why person. Sometimes
Yeah.
when people are doing something one way, I like to know why. You mentioned you pull pieces from here and you kind of do research a little bit there. And that is the trust but verify. There's so
Right.
much of this information, there's so many different sources out there. You try to hone in on one, you kind of trust it, but always verify the work.
For sure.
You
It's
might
kind of
learn
like,
something new.
yeah, it's like skepticism 101. You just need to like take everything with a grain of salt and go and verify it for yourself, either through your own, experiential learning, like apply it, see if it works. If it works, then it works. But have some sort of level of quantification and analysis that you're doing to reach that, assurance of it working. Because if you're just like, applying stuff willy-nilly and saying, damn, this is really good cannabis, they all worked, that's not necessarily true. Like, and I feel like that is something that I've seen a lot of growers do, especially new growers, because you get led around with so much information and told that
Yeah.
this is the way to do it, this is that, you know all sorts of ways are the way to do it. And so what do? You start, you'll test one way. It didn't work for you, but you still got to remember you're a new grower. And so maybe it didn't work the first time, but it might work the second time. You just have to maybe tweak something. Maybe you ran into a point where you were overwatering. That's one of the easiest things for new growers to do. And so, yeah, but the information does get sort of like thrown around there a lot. And it's hard to parse through as a new grower sometimes.
It's good to have those goals clearly defined in your head, but
Right.
I always say every answer should come with "it depends." Just like you said, like my style works great indoors in Washington, where outdoors in Colorado, I would have to adjust my advice, because if
Right.
you're following my indoor advice for Washington, you're going to have a harder time. So that experimentation is part of it. And you're right. As a new grower, we want to do everything. We want to do it right now, but that's just not the way this plant works.
Sure.
This plant has definitely taught me patience. And I want to get into maybe your beginning into growing cannabis, whether you jumped right into commercial, or whether it was on the home scale, or if, hey, maybe you've been growing veggies prior to that.
For sure.
And then I want to touch on watering, because we brought that up as a problem, and I want to help people solve that. But let's hear, how did you get involved with growing cannabis?
Well, so let's see. When I was like much younger, my dad would grow his little crop every year in California during the 215 days,
Okay.
and
Yeah.
he would do it in a way where I never knew that he was growing cannabis, and I always thought that we just had a skunk problem every summer, and that's what I was told, is that we had a skunk
Right.
problem. Growing up in California too, you don't think anything otherwise, because it
No.
does really smell like skunk if you're not used to the difference in and the nuances in the terpene profiles, right? It's kind of like one of those things that your senses play a trick on you, telling you that it's one thing, but it's just something that's similar. And so I was around it for a long time without knowing it. And then when I was around like 17 or 18, I was like interested in trying it. And so I I think got some from like a buddy at school and brought it home and smoked it in a little fucking aluminum foil pipe that I made
Yes.
in my
Yep.
room. And then at the time I was like smoking cigarettes. So I like was like, oh, I'll just mask the flavor or mask the smell
Yeah.
with cigarettes, and then just be like, oh, it's some dude on the street smoking a cigarette. It worked. But
Oh.
um, yeah, that was the first time I actually tried it. And then uh, like the summer in between going from high school to college, I uh, my buddy had been his mom had like a little pot plant in her window, because she found a seed and planted it,
Okay.
and it was just growing in their window. And she I don't think, I think she knew, but I think she was kind of just like playing ignorant. But my buddy was like, dude, that's a pot plant. My mom doesn't know she found the seed like in my shit. And I was like, I is that what a pot plant looks like? Like it was like in their like above their sink, in the window
Yeah.
above their sink in their
Oh,
kitchen.
wow.
And I was just like,
Right out
"Look,
there.
that's a pot plant." And so my buddy's like, I have more seeds. And so we planted them, and we would move the plants between our houses like almost every day, because there was a
Did you?
schedule where you could put it up in my house, and we could put it up on like the hillside where we were living, and it got really good sun, and then we could put it in his yard because he could hide it behind a shed. And
Wow.
uh his mom wouldn't find it, or maybe she didn't care, I really wasn't sure. But
She was
it
going to be the ripper that came right at harvest. She'd be like, wow, boys, I don't know what happened.
yeah, but obviously we were like fucking it up or something, because it never flowered, or it could have just even been like hemp seeds, or who knows.
Okay.
But it
Yeah.
I like we couldn't get them to flower, and I had to go to college, and so I brought the plants with me
Oh,
to
jeez.
college. And this was actually, now that I'm remembering, this was actually the summer after my first year of college that I was back home for it. And I didn't grow it the summer before college. It was the summer after my first year of college. And I brought him up, and I had an apartment. And so I just put him in my room in front of the window in my apartment, and it like flowered, but I had no idea what I was doing. And so as soon as the hairs started popping out, they like got all orange and stuff. And I was like, oh, I got to harvest it. The hairs are orange. But it was really just because it was getting terrible lighting schedules. And I think it was re-vegging and, doing all sorts of weird stuff. And so I just hung it in my closet, microwaved some to get it drier quicker. Had no idea what I was doing. And
you could read it online though.
Hey, I tried smoking it, and I think I tricked myself into thinking that I got high because I was already smoking a bunch of pot, and so I was like,
okay,
I think I was just like, oh no, I grew it. It's awesome, man, and like this is good stuff. But then from there, I like didn't grow again for maybe 4 years or so until I met my current partner, and we were actually living up in a small apartment, and we just grew a plant outside that year, and it was like the first time I actually saw the plant fully flower. That was really interesting, but that ended poorly. But I won't get into that. And then from there, let's see, and then I didn't grow, and that was in 2013. I think it was 2012, the summer of 2012.
And that's right around the cusp of legalization in Washington and in Colorado. Medical systems were taken off across the country. So,
well, we both had our recreational cards in California. We'd go to the different dispensaries all over the place, but some people still don't like to see that happening. So, whatever. But 12 years, and then I didn't grow again until 2020. And basically, I was living in Portland, Oregon, and COVID hit, and I had a brand new job lined up. I was helping open up a new restaurant as their like executive sous chef, and it was going to be a dope position. But COVID hit, and the project had to stop. The money was coming in from Japan too, and the traveling between US and Japan was completely shut down. So they couldn't come out and oversee the project. It was just like couldn't happen anymore. And so we were living in our apartment in Portland, whittling through our savings, getting help from both of our parents. And we just couldn't sustain it because there was just no opportunities. And we were both in culinary. We met at culinary school. There's no chance for an income to sustain what our apartment cost was. So we packed up, moved down to Corvallis area, actually Albany, where my parents were living at the time, and moved in with them. And at that point, we were trying to figure out what we were going to do for work because we still had to start to help with bills, and we were, pretty darn broke. And so I was like, well, cannabis is still open. And that's when I started to look into jobs. And I found work at a local farm. But before I got that job, I wanted to learn how to grow cannabis because I was like, I've seen it grow. I know that it's a photoperiod plant. And you asked, had I grown vegetables and stuff before? And yes, like every summer we had a vegetable garden, no matter where we were living. We always found a way to have a vegetable garden, whether it was like on our balcony and it was just a bunch of Fox Farm Ocean Forest bags just ripped open at the top with a tomato popped in it. Those do great. And
direct in bag.
Exactly. We had that idea of early substrate, or like large substrate for like the organic style of gardening early on. But yeah, we gardened every summer. I was gardening all the way since I was a kid. You know, we had a huge vegetable garden with a bunch of fruit trees and different berry
Nice.
bushes and vines and stuff. And my grandma was really big into gardening. I've mentioned that before a few times on my podcast, that she was kind of the one that taught me a lot about gardening, because she would have the patience whenever I was over there to like show me the fun side of gardening whenever she would watch me if my parents were out of town or something. Where my parents, they were just like, go do weeding in the beds, help us pick all this fruit. And it was like, that's not the fun stuff. The fun stuff is like looking through all the seeds that you want to grow that year, planting them, going over and saying, hey, this is
Yeah.
where we're going to plant them this year. How do you want to plant them? And like asking the kid how they want to do it, rather than being like, this is how you got to do gardening and it's only the shitty part for you. So I thought that, I really look back and I thank grandma for that. But um yeah, so we moved back in with my parents, and I wanted to grow, and I had this like really shitty, it was like one of those 4-bar lights that were all purple, that
Oh
you could
yeah.
get for like a house plant or something off
Oh
of
yeah. Oh
Amazon.
yeah.
So I
Yes.
had one of
The
those,
wands.
and I had that, and then but I was like, this isn't enough light. I know cannabis needs more light, because I was reading through, uh I think I had like the Jorge Cervantes
Nice.
weed encyclopedia, and so I was reading through that, and then I had some other book, um and I was trying to figure out what I could do to grow it. And so I started looking online and found a few different forums, and I don't even remember. I think it was like Roll It Up or growweedeasy.com. Like
Yeah. Yeah.
some of those more popular sites in 2020, and just started doing as much research as I could. And so I built a box basically out of, I made a wood stand, because I decided I'm going to grow hydroponically. It seems to be the easiest, where all I need to know is how to mix the bottles. And I loved chemistry growing
Right.
up. So I was just like, all I need to do is know how to adjust these ratios. That's an easy thing. I need to make sure that I have a meter to make sure that everything is within parameters. Again, easy. And then I need to do something to deliver that water to the plant. And I looked up whatever the easiest thing was. And at the time, to me in my head, it was ebb and flow. And so I
Yeah.
created a mini one plant ebb and flow table inside of this wooden stand with a 5-gallon bucket underneath it with the nutrient water, and it pumped it up into a tray with a bell siphon. It would fill up and then drain back into the bucket. And I just put one plant in there in a, like one of them, it was a large mesh hydro basket. But then
Okay. Yep.
I didn't know about fabric pots at the time. And so I took one of those, it was like the plastic mesh hydro baskets, lined it with like geotextile fabric, and then filled it with
Huh.
cocoa, and
Huh.
let it run. And it was inside of, like, so it was on this stand, and then I knew it needed to remain dark. I was like, it's a photo period plant, and I knew that. So I created a tent with mylar blankets and moving blankets wrapped around it,
Mm-hmm.
and then just clipped all up around it, and it worked. And I grew runts the first time that I
Wow.
grew weed again, and I was like, ah, I'm off to the races. And then, like, while I was halfway through that first grow, I got a job at the first place, commercially, and I haven't looked back.
That's an awesome journey. I like how it started younger, in the garden with grandma. That's where a lot of people tend to get their experience. I'm kind of the opposite. And I joke, cannabis is the gateway drug to gardening, because I had no interest until I started growing cannabis. And then, the more I learned about the soil biome, the more I learned about my gut biome. And that's one thing that really draws me to cannabis. And so I'm like, wait a minute, if I treat my soil better than my own gut, I can take something from that. And then you take, why do we grow at home? Why do we take the approaches we do? Well, it's because we can control the inputs, we know the quality of the product, and we know how it's handled. Why wouldn't I want that with my fruits and veggies too. So
Mm-hmm.
I kind of took the leap from cannabis into gardening, but it, the opposite way. Cannabis made me know what I'm doing out there, whereas gardening for you kind of helped you when you came indoors. And I do like the DIY factor. I started very DIY myself. It was before grow tents were even a thing, so you had to get DIY. But
Yep.
those moving blankets, brilliant because they're heavy, so they really do block light very well. They
Yeah.
had the mylar for reflection. Well, one thing that pops out in my head, because there's people from all areas of the world that watch this show. And I know there are like deserts when it comes to grow equipment. So there's a lot of
Sure.
people out there creating their own grow environments. In that scenario, were you aware of ventilation, or how did you kind of account for ventilation, or maybe keeping the temperature and the humidity in check? Because
Yeah,
moving blankets are a great thing to use, but they really do suffocate a lot of the airflow.
for sure. So I did know about ventilation. So I had a small fan in there, and then I also had a really small dehumidifier. It was I
Okay.
found this. It was like I think it was marketed as um, a gun case dehumidifier, but it's an
Okay.
electric one. And
Small.
so I just stuck it in the tent with it around week uh, 3, I think, because I everywhere I looked, it was make sure that you drop your humidity by the time that all the flowers are there.
Right.
So that's
Right.
what I
Right.
did. So I had the ability to at least pull moisture from the environment, and I had a fan to move air through the environment. And then halfway through the grow, I did research and find that I want air exchange. And so at the base of the tent, there was already some ability for air movement to come through the bottom of the tent. And so the top of it was like an upside down, like the cardboard trays that appliances will come in, where
Yes. Yep.
they're kind of like really rigid, sturdy cardboard. So that was just turned upside down on the top. And so what I did is I created like a light screen um active air system where I got like two uh computer fans,
Okay.
and then I put a box over it with a hole cut in the side, so that and the side facing away from where like all the light from the room would go
Hmm.
to it, so the air could then get pushed out of that, and the two fans were just kind of like sandwiching the cardboard at the top, just to move air out and through the tent. And it worked really well. So yeah, I was definitely like aware of a lot of these different environmental um requirements, I guess would be the thing. Because and I got sidetracked earlier, but I had those 4 purple bar lights, and
Yeah.
I also got just a 100-watt quantum board,
Hmm.
uh, LED quantum board at the time. Uh, some off-brand board,
Yeah.
but it worked well. It definitely like got the plant to where it needed to be.
They will. I'm looking at one right there, and funny enough, I'm redoing my sheds outside and going through some of the old boxes. And my first grow lights were CFL bulbs, not even like anything special. They were the kind you'd use in your house, but I had the splitter, so it's like the hanging, the cord with the socket at the end, so you can hang it. And then I bought a little Y splitter, and I'd have 2 CFL bulbs coming out, and it's I don't know the last time I opened this box, but the ocean air here kind of corrodes everything. And as I'm moving, I open the box and there's like 15 of these things in there. I got all the Y splitters, I got all the cords, I've got the metal domes that typically come on. Sorry.
That's funny.
Uh that come with it. And I just like, I threw it in the trash. I feel bad about doing it, but I don't use corroded electronics. But where there's a will, there's a way.
Yep.
And a little bit of light can allow you to grow a plant. It gets you something you can hopefully harvest. It's not going to be as bountiful. The yields are going to be small, but where there's a will, there's a way. Something is
Yep.
better than nothing. So, both of us kind of got started in that same realm, and we've, progressed as we learned more about the plant, learned more about the needs, and just availability of things. Like, my mind was blown when I was like, grow tents are a thing, because I had just framed
Yeah.
out like another false wall and another grow rooms in another place. I'm just like, wait a minute, I didn't need to do all this and spend like $2,000. So
Yeah.
I'm on the grow tents now. Um, I want to get back though, because I promised people we were going to try to offer a solution to overwatering,
Oh, for sure.
and that could be kind of an interesting thing, because again, I always assume everybody grows like me. I'm like, he's in soil, he's in indoors. You were starting with hydro, and ebb and flow for people too is basically you kind of putting the water in and then you're taking it out and then you're putting it in and then you're taking it out. Is there any sort of like frequency that works? Because I don't think many people are using that system, but there is a brilliance to it.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think that there's a lot of people using it anymore because the drain to waste
Mm-hmm.
application of hydroponics is so much more effective and requires less maintenance. So there's just, less hours, human hours put into the end product. Um, but when I would grow the ebb and flow system, I would just do one cycle a day. The substrate was large enough where you could just do one cycle a day, and it provided enough water to the plants. What I did learn early on through my research, though, was uh, the way in which water moves through cocoa coir is that it requires time to wick and for the salts to dissolve in it that are already in the substrate, as well as um, be absorbed or transported through osmosis up through the whole cocoa pot, because at this point I'm fighting gravity with
Yep.
with the ebb and flow system. And so what I would do is it would be like 4 or 5 cycles of pushing the water up and bringing it down over the course of, I think it was like 2 hours or an hour.
Okay.
And so, it's really interesting because even still now, what I do in a commercial space is I still provide that initial hydration over the course of around 2 hours to the plants. And then from there, I add on more irrigations or less, or, I'll either have just that amount of irrigations or I'll add more irrigations depending on the stage of the plant. And I find it interesting that the way that, in the terminology of crop steering, that would be what I grew originally was just a generative cue for the plant. So it was just providing one irrigation every day and allowing for a dryback to occur every night. And so the air exchange within the substrate was really high. So the roots didn't have any issues because, one of the things about overwatering is there's not really like overwatering itself isn't a thing. Plants don't drown in water, they drown in a lack of oxygen. And so a lot of overwatering is just providing too much water to the plant before they can use it all up, which creates a hypoxic environment, which just adds anaerobic bacteria breeding grounds, and those can attack the roots and cause root-borne illnesses and diseases and pathogens to proliferate. And so that can just cause a whole cycle of issues. And so now I'm always making sure that plants are always getting an adequate dry back in between waterings, even in a hydroponic situation where it's a media based hydroponic situation. Because, like with DWC and stuff like that, you're providing air to the roots constantly through your air stones and whatnot. And so it's an air enriched environment, and it doesn't just feel like water. It's not just anaerobic water to the plants, it's healthy, active, bubbling water. But with like a media based situation, you can saturate to field capacity, which is just the point at which you get runoff. And if you then saturate it again before the plant has the time to use up those roots and allow for that air to be pulled back into the pot, then you could just cause because the plant might have already, it might not need more water.
Right.
And, and so it might just stay wet, especially if you like irrigate too close to the lights being off or while the lights are off, where there's not a lot of transpiration happening, or less than what is happening at like peak daylight hours or lights on hours. Then you can run into hypoxic root conditions.
That's a great point there. That's kind of a little gold nugget I want to just like pause for, because the time that you water is very important. I typically like to do it a couple hours after the lights come on, and
Yeah.
I do avoid it close to lights off. As you said, the capillary action isn't the same because the plant isn't transpiring, which is basically sweating. But also, one concern too is if you water a large enough soil mass and then you close it up for the night in your tent, that extra moisture is just going to sit there and the humidity is going
For
to
sure.
build. So that's another good reason of why to time it out. So thank you for kind of mentioning that on the path here. But yeah, I wanted to pause
And
for that. Go
if I
ahead.
could add something to that also, it's why I've
Please.
stopped using fabric pots for hydroponics. For a long time, I know that people were very geared towards using fabric or mesh pots um, for like drain to waste irrigation and other hydroponic applications, but they lose a lot of the moisture just through evaporation. And so you can actually cause an increased EC condition within the root zone that is
Mm-hmm.
not due to the fact that the plant is uptaking water, but due to the fact that the water is just evaporating, which can cause, again, more potential issues with the plant due to poor root conditions. Um, we always talk about in the commercial space maintaining the health of the substrate. And it's not necessarily like the substrate is a living thing, but the roots in there are, and making sure that you're, doing a proper amount of, whether it be runoff or if you need to flush, doing so in those rare occasions, just to make sure that you aren't causing damage to the roots where you don't need to. And so that's a big reason why we've stopped using fabric pots for hydroponics and cocoa. That and root aphids. It's way easier to control root aphids when you're in a solid plastic pot or something that is not permeable or breathable.
Is that just because they maybe don't have places to escape and your treatment can get to them better, or what?
Well, so the root aphids will actually be able to get through most of these fabric pots.
Uh,
Um, and so, especially, and even if they can't, you're creating a high oxygen environment around that side of the pot where the root aphids can hang out and reproduce without necessary. You might not be able to attack them with the same sort of IPM protocols that you are able to effectively apply by just applying it from the top of the pot, as well as, if there's any holes at the bottom, just making sure that IPM application gets into those areas. It's just, there's less areas of ingress for the pests to actually attack the roots. And so it's helped us. We had root aphids at the commercial facility. It's something that happens, but we have
yep.
been able to, knock on wood, eradicate them from the facility, and we've been, root aphid free for over a year now, which is
Nice.
it's one of the
Nice.
worst pests that you can get, even worse than like russet mites, in my opinion, because russet mites, you have a bunch of different ways to handle them that are contact kills that work really well, but there's only like one contact kill that works well for aphids in my experience, and that's like pyrethrins. And there's a lot of issues with pyrethrins in different commercial spaces. And so when you only have a small amount of things available to help prevent a pest, it makes that pest that much more difficult, in my opinion. It's one of the reasons why I stopped growing organically at home, is because
Okay.
I think I either brought them in from
Mm-hmm.
like work, or I had them somewhere else in my garden just because they are prolific on other plants as well, and they have like the ability to overwinter fairly easy. So they're a pain.
They are, and if their population gets too large, then the next generation will grow wings, and then they can
Absolutely.
move from place to place. So,
And if that
yeah,
population gets too large, they will move into the canopy of the plant and start feeding off of the sap of the plant like a normal aphid would. So it's
yeah,
terrible.
that's crazy. Not a pest that you want to have, and I do want to come back to that one because again, being a root aphid, it's not something that you just it's crawling on the surface. Hopefully not. You're behind the ball if that's what you're seeing. But kind of you're talking about fabric pots because fabric pots are very popular, particularly with organic growers. You see them a lot. Like the larger gallon, the 30 gallons.
Sure.
But even at the home level, 5, 7. Shoot, I have 7-gallon fabric pots in there right now. The one thing that kind of made me giggle. So uh, when fabric pots really kind of made its way into the cannabis marketplace, the selling point was, well, the roots are going to air prune. They'll get to the side and then they kind of poke out, the air kills them, and then the tip, and then it grows more to replace that.
Right.
So in theory, awesome, right? I mean, doesn't that sound good? More roots, bigger the roots, the bigger the fruits.
Hmm.
But then what we kind of came to find out was, particularly with like a 5 or a 7-gallon fabric pot, your core, like that inner like 2 gallons, is going to remain a lot wetter than the outside because of all the oxygen and the air that's hitting that, particularly even if you have a fan on it. So
Hmm.
it made watering a little tricky. And then what they did is they lined the fabric pots with a impermeable barrier
Right.
similar to plastic, and then they just have the bottom amount that roots can come down and air prune, kind of like a plastic pot anyways. So
Yeah. Shout out
there,
Sustainable Village.
yeah, that's actually where I picked up my recent Bluemont tensiometer, which is how
Nice.
I measure water capacity. um, but yeah, so I wanted to point that out with the fabric pots. I still use plastic. They're easier for me to clean.
Oh, and
Just easier
transplant
to
too.
handle, able to stack. Yeah, you can. I mean, taking roots out. It's my final pot. My
For
fabric
sure.
pots are my final pots.
Yep.
Um,
I
so
found
it all
that one
comes
out.
down to preference. Me too, the first time, because again, as you're always plastic. As a grower, you're like, yeah, everybody's using this. It's new. I've never tried it. And then yeah, you get it, and you're just like, oh my gosh, you're ripping. It's like pulling gum out of your hair, guys.
Sure.
It's not easy.
And then they
um,
say you can reuse them, but you got to use some sort of enzyme to break down all that lignin mass from the roots that are dried up and crusted onto it. And you need to be able to strip the salts out of it. So you need like two
yeah,
different chemicals to actually make them fully reusable, without potentially providing some sort of vector for pathogen, right? Like that. It
yeah,
it's just
absolutely.
it's a it's a weird. I just
It,
fabric pots. I think it was a weird trend.
yeah, it's weird because we do want to be sustainable. Again, like I like the idea of it, but in reality, and again, this is probably one of those, looks good on paper, but in reality, like plastic pots for me, they just last so much longer. And really, if I had a bunch of 7-gallon plastic pots, I wouldn't be in these 7-gallon fabric pots, but they're the largest ones that I have. That's what I wanted at this time, so I'm using them right now.
Yeah.
But so, and I got onto that because I wanted to let people know, like the outside dries a little bit more. And you talked about crop steering and the accumulation of salts, like particularly in cocoa, why the dry back is controlled. Some people,
Hmm.
always keep it at a similar moisture level, but when the synthetic nutrients are in a dry environment, they can kind of like crystallize, if it's not absorbed, if it's not uptaken. Just for everybody watching, I know you're aware of this, but I wanted to let people know that you can get those spikes in EC, which is why you don't necessarily want to do too big of a drop or an uncontrolled dry back in something like cocoa, because when those salts kind of crystallize and then you water again, well, it disperses and you can almost get like that hot shot. You get that root zone, that tip burn. So when you were using these kind of systems, which again sounds very familiar or very similar to like a SIP system or a bottom feeding system, which is something that people are using today. But ebb and flow is kind of like an OG type of SIP system. For controlling the EC though, and the amount of nutrients in there, how were you kind of monitoring that? Was it just by feel? Was it reading the plants, or did you have an instrument to kind of help guide you there?
Right. So I mean, I got an EC and a pH meter um, before I ever put a plant in the ground or
Nice.
into the cocoa. I just it was part of like I part of my research was you got to be able to monitor it, and so I was like, well, I need to get something to monitor it, and I didn't like the idea of using test strips for
No.
for pH. That's fine, but you can't measure EC with test strips, and everyone was talking about parts per million, 500 scale, 700 scale. But both of those are based off of like a single salt. I think one of them's like potassium
Yep.
sulfate or potassium chloride, and the other one's sodium chloride. And so the reference isn't as great as just using electrical conductivity. And so what I would do is I would fill up my 5-gallon reservoir. I would pH it, and I think I was shooting for 5.7 to 5.8 based on my research then. And I think the EC was like 1.5 or something like that. And I wouldn't add more nutrients for a week. So I would let the plant eat it
Okay.
up. And I was, at that point too, I was measuring the volume loss on a daily basis, as well as the electrical conductivity loss on a daily basis, just to make sure that the plant was actually uptaking the EC from the water that it was being fed. And, the plant was, and I was really impressed by that. I was like, wow, this is so cool. I can see that the actual salts are falling at a greater rate than the water is. And so what I would do then is every 2 days I would top it back up with fresh cold water, so that it would, and it was sitting on like a cement floor, so it was
Oh wow.
staying very
Nice and
cool.
chill.
And I didn't think about that at the time, the temperature being very important, but it
Yeah.
was probably right around 68 degrees. So I think I lucked out. Um,
Yep. And
but
that's just
yeah,
dissolved oxygen for people. For people listening,
that's
like
just for
the
dissolved
greatest
oxygen.
dissolved oxygen. Yeah.
Yep. Greatest dissolved oxygen at a healthy temperature for the plants, because you can go down to like 60 degrees and have a lot more dissolved oxygen, but 60 degrees in a 78-degree environment doesn't the
Shock.
plant doesn't they need to adjust for that temperature before they can actually start to move that water up through the plant, because it can cause shock. So I was lucky. But I would just top it off, and then I would replace the whole reservoir once a week. And I think I was using, it was like at the time Fox Farm had just come out with their Cultivation Nation trio, so it was really similar to
Mm-hmm.
the General Hydroponics trio. And I was using that, and then Hydrozyme or Enzymes Complete, one of the two. And I was just pHing with the General Hydroponics blue and orange. I think everyone knows the GH blue and
Yes.
orange packs.
I've got them.
Uh,
I've got them myself.
so it was just that. But that was the one and only plant that I grew in ebb and flow.
And so why did you move away from that? Just convenience? You wanted to try something new, or
I wanted to try something new because, again, I was just trying to learn as much as I could. And I think I was partially inspired due to the work that I was doing at the time. So I decided I wanted to do some sort of synganic setup where I would
nice?
have like an organic or an amended substrate, and then feed it uh, more fertilizer. And I think at the time I used FOOP. When it first came out, they were giving out a bunch of stuff, so I got a bunch
Yeah.
of free stuff, and I tried to run it hydroponically, and it did not work. I lost the entire crop. It all molded out. It all just dried up, browned out, had
Oh,
a bunch of deficiencies. Because what I tried to do is I took I'm like, oh, well, I have cocoa coir. I can feed cocoa coir hydroponically, so I can do a lot of drip irrigation because the air to water ratio is greater than like sphagnum peat moss. So, okay,
Yeah.
cool. I'll use that. I have all this down to earth, all purpose tomato fertilizer that I use in my outdoor garden. So I mix that at what I looked up online. It was like a couple cups per cubic foot or something. Mix that up, put them into fabric pots, set them up, watered them in. Plants were looking great all the way through veg. But then, I didn't add more of the down to earth, and I should have. What I did is I just started feeding this FOOP stuff, and it clogged up all my emitters. So I then started hand watering it in. I was probably watering way too much of it in at the time. And so I think, because I wasn't checking the EC of it. I wasn't even thinking that that was necessary. So I was just watering it in. I don't even know if I was pHing it or anything, because I heard you don't have to pH for organics. And I was like, oh, cool. That was the pain in the ass last time, so I don't want to do that this time. So, but it just completely flopped. The whole thing ended up turning to shit. And it was like the first time that I grew something in a tent, because
Literal.
I like upgraded.
Oh, no.
I was like, oh, this piece of shit wooden frame with Mylar is terrible. It started to
You're like, wait, grow tents exist?
exactly. So I got a grow tent, tried to set it up, went like all out, got setting up a drip system and a drain system, and it didn't work. And so I was like, well, this sucks. So I did more research, and I went back to doing cocoa. And so I just got trays, like the green circular trays with the round plastic razor inserts, set all those up, got a shop vac, and just watered them drain to waste with the rest of the Fox Farm trio. Had a great harvest. Vacuuming out the trays every day. That worked perfect. And then, because I really wanted to give organic like a real try, to try and see if it was something that was worthwhile. And so then I started doing more research, and I found like Build a Soil. I found stuff like Clackamas Coot and his methods.
Yeah.
I started listening to like Growing with Fishes with Steve Reisner. And so I started to get, this insight into, a larger substrate with a big buffet of food. And that's kind of the thought process I went going into it. And so I found, and at this point I had moved to a new cultivation facility, and they were doing all organics indoor. And they were buying substrate from a local company, and they were feeding it with BioBiz. So using the full line of BioBiz in a commercial setting, which I look back at now and I'm like, that's
expensive.
Insane. Oh, it was so expensive. Our price per pound must have been through the roof. And so
back before margins were a concern, right?
Yeah. And so we were doing that, and I think we were doing it with like Royal Gold King's Mix. And it was working great. Beautiful harvests, wonderful terpene profiles, but a pain in the butt carrying 15-gallon pots around and moving them from veg to flower. And yeah, that was a backbreaker, but beautiful harvests. And then they wanted to just go to water only, because they were planning on setting up a drip system so that they could just irrigate automatically, but have a living soil base. And so this is where we found then the local organic soil producer. I think they're called Organic Matters here in Oregon. And they make a wonderful substrate. And you can run it start to finish all water. And I found that it worked really well. I picked it up, put it in a 30-gallon fabric pot with the plastic sides from Sustainable Village, and with a little, fabric ring at the bottom, set in a tray, and I watered it with no runoff, and I kept it. I found that, like, if I could just dig my finger down, as long as the top below the mulch layer, because I was like, well, mulch, I do that in my garden outside. Everyone's saying to mulch, all these people that I was now finding that what they said was working for me, where before I was kind of going by the seat of my pants in my first attempt of organics. And now I was listening to people that have been doing it, and it worked great. So I just kept the moisture consistent, sticking with watering it every day, but only watering it a little bit every day. Like in that 30-gallon pot, I think I've probably fed it less than a gallon of water every day, maybe like 2 quarts.
Okay. Was it just it was more waterings but less duration versus like less watering but larger amount?
Sure, yeah, less volume, but consistent. And so that's where I was finding really good success with the rest of my grows, is consistency in irrigation. And this goes back to like good watering practices. So yeah, I just wanted to keep it consistent. So I wanted to gauge how much the plant used each day and then bring it right back to that amount. And I was keeping it at, if we look at the substrate and we look at the volumetric water content of that substrate for the organic stuff, I think I was keeping it right around 50%, maybe going like fluctuating between 50 and 40%. And by just replacing that 10% every day, I just found that the plants thrived and it was
Sweet
really
spot.
easy. And then I just amended it with the down to earth, like BioLive, which had less nitrogen so that I could control the nitrogen levels a little bit better. And I would just re-amend that every run. And I think I got like 5 runs out of that 30-gallon pot, and they were all great.
Very nice. I'm a big fan of the kind of the water only soils as well. That's something that for years I've been trying different companies, been doing different blends, because ultimately, my goal is I want to get more people growing. I don't necessarily care how you feed it, what style you want to go with, whichever one is going to get you started, do it. And then you can expand into some other things. And I do have a preference, but I always just want to get people going. So one of the things too, going back to, I've got a lot of things written down because you're making some awesome points here. But just the water saturation, you were talking about, field capacity. It can only accept so much water before it starts to run out. You want to keep that good air and water mix in there. But you mentioned, if you did water it to field capacity, and let's say, it didn't fully use all of the water that was in there, you water it again, and that bottom layer kind of, it's what wet feet. Plants can get the wet feet. That is one of the, in my opinion, probably one of the main reasons we start to see purple stems. There's many things that can cause purple stems, and it does kind of relate back to like a nutrient uptake issue. But in my personal experience, I've always found when the feet are a little bit too wet, I'll start to see some purpling. And there's,
For
again,
sure.
other things that contribute to it. But I wanted to mention that. And we're also talking about, watering, and you were mentioning runoff. In the cocoa, you were able to kind of measure the EC. Whereas like soil runoff isn't as accurate. So were you using that, I guess is my question. Were you using the runoff EC from cocoa to determine your next feedings? Or was that a factor that you were looking at? And have you ever tried to apply the same to soil? And
So no, I wasn't using the EC to drive my feed.
Okay.
And it's something that I learned early, and I still even use it today, which I think I lucked out on, just finding the right information early on. And so if you're using your uh your runoff to dictate your feed EC, then you're going to be chasing your tail, because if you have a target in your runoff, it's always going to be, in my experience, 80% of the time, it's going to be higher than your input EC, just based on plant uptake of water versus nutrient level, how much EC it's actually pulling out of that water, as well as, no matter what, you're always getting evaporation off of the surface of your pots. So you're always losing water, but increasing the concentration of the salts at the surface there. And especially if you're doing drain to waste, you're hydrating the top first. And so that's then rehydrating all of those dried or concentrated salts, pulling them into solution, and then pulling that solution down through the plant. And that's why you want runoff, is to then push that extra EC out of the plant. So if you're pushing that extra EC out of the plant, it's going to end up in your runoff. When you're measuring your runoff, let's say your target, right? Because the true target, and this requires exact and expensive instrumentation, is to measure the pore water electrical conductivity. So that's the actual water where the roots are. Sorry. That's the actual water where the roots are. And that's what the plant is pulling water and nutrients from. So that's where you're going to run into your true osmotic stressors. If you're seeing extra EC in the runoff, that doesn't necessarily mean that the EC in the pore water is greater than what you're reading, or the same or lower. You can't tell unless you're actually measuring what's in there. So chasing a number out of the bottom of the pot, if you're changing your input, let's say your target is, you want, let's say your input is 3 EC and your output is 4.556 EC. But you're saying, well, I want that target in the root zone to be 3, so I need to bring that down, my input. So you're going to start bringing down your input, but you're then going to start bringing it down below certain thresholds that the plant is now used to feeding from and is part of its metabolic cycle. So you're going to slow down its metabolism, which could run into things like light burn, because if its metabolism slows down, then its photosynthesis needs to slow down. But if you're still providing the same amount of light energy to the plant, then that photosynthesis you're going to interrupt the Rubisco cycle, and you're going to cause the plant to show stressors, nutrient imbalances, deficiencies. Those can start to present. So if you're chasing that EC in the runoff, you might run into those issues, especially if you're using it to dictate your input. What you can do is, if you know that an input works for you, I really like, for most home growers, mid-flower cycle, I usually suggest 3.0 EC. Without CO2, it works really well because there's a high enough nutrient level in there of all the different constituents to really make sure that it has everything that it needs. And your job as the grower is to manage the substrate health with runoff. And it is wasteful. And that's one of the things that I know a lot of people have a problem with drain to waste irrigation, but it is efficient and it works really well. And you can run a lower EC, but the plant is never going to, in my opinion, reach its fullest potential.
And is this cocoa that you're referring to, or
cocoa
and soil?
Okay. This is hydroponics specifically.
Okay, perfect.
Yeah. And so, because in soil, I never want to achieve runoff unless I have an actual problem, in which case I do need to leach the soil to pull, excess salts out that are causing a problem or nutrient imbalance in the plant. But that's something where that's a mismanagement of inputs and not a mismanagement of irrigation in most cases.
Okay.
So sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, go ahead. You could finish your thought there. I was going to jump in.
So specifically with hydroponics, you're trying to maintain that substrate health by achieving enough runoff to basically reset the substrate to what that input water, the source, electrical conductivity and pH are, and by pushing out the overly concentrated evaporation areas and where the roots might have taken up too much of this or not enough of this. You're just trying to reset it so it has that perfect buffet again right in front of it. And you do that every day for consistency's sake, because they have a circadian rhythm just like we do.
And we mentioned, balance. Balance is really the key to healthy plant growth, because we know some minerals and nutrients will bind with others and make them not plant available. But I'm glad you touched on that, because it's been years since it's been a long time since I've grown in cocoa. But one of the things, coming up and learning that was the runoff. The runoff was important. And, the reason I asked that question of, do you monitor your output? Because when I was last looking at that, that was kind of what you would do. You would have your target goal for what the plant wants. And like a 3.0 EC strikes me as high. I like how you explained it. So it makes sense. But I want to, in case anybody.
Could I
Go
actually
ahead.
touch on one more thing with the runoff?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
you can use your runoff if you are keeping your input the same. And so that's where I was saying, if you're using runoff to adjust your input, that's where you could run into imbalances or nutrient deficiencies, and just causing stress to the plant by fluctuating what it has available to it. So by pushing enough runoff, especially if you're removing runoff in between irrigation events so that you can monitor each irrigation event's runoff, if you're needing to push extra runoff, then you can see when it does come down to your acceptable level. And you'll usually, if you're keeping your plant healthy and you're keeping it consistent, then you should be able to see healthy runoff every day in your entire runoff catchment, if you are catching it, monitoring it, and draining it.
And that's, too, you have to, I like to measure the volume of water that you put in versus the volume that comes out. You can get a percentage of what is actually come out.
It's
And
usually
the
like
way you
10 to
explain,
20% for adequate substrate maintenance in cocoa.
and because you need to be able to have enough to, if you were to monitor it, sometimes it's hard to get the truncheon or your little blue lab pen in this much of runoff. So the way that I had learned it back then, and again, the way you explained it, knowing what I know now, makes much more sense. But it was almost like, okay, let's say you had a target of 2.0 EC, and it comes out at like 1.3. Well, then you add a little bit higher. You go to maybe 2.7 to try to bring that runoff into the 2.0 target range. And this was cocoa only. But one thing that absolutely screwed me up is when I did go to soil, is I was treating it kind of like cocoa. I was trying to get my runoff. I was trying to measure it, and you absolutely can't measure it because there's so many different interactions in the soil, and that the rhizosphere, just the small area around the root tips, based off of different microbes, it's going to have its own kind of EC or even pH range as well. So that's why with soil, it's a lot harder for people who are maybe trying to adapt or use both. Maybe, one thing that caught me up too was just the different pH ranges that you would want. Cocoa or hydroponics is a little bit different than soil. So that's another thing that may be throwing people off. Commercially, I'm sorry I missed this, but were you guys still trying organic approach, or were you doing the cocoa?
So where we left off in my story was the last place, or at the place that was using the BioBiz, right? And then we switched over to a living soil that we were water only. We were still hand watering at that time, but I left that company for various reasons, but then moved on to a small grow as a sort of really quick interim stay just to continue to earn some money. But that wasn't a great fit. And from there, I actually moved to the place that I'm still currently at, and I've been at for over 3 years now. And
Nice.
so at that time, I was growing hydroponically at home. And the reason being was that it was just easy, it was efficient, it was clean. I started to see the issues that could potentially pop up with heavy metals in organic soils, with molds, especially considering the soil itself is a giant mass of molds and mycelium at different
Yeah.
stages in the growth cycle and in the soil cycle as well. And I knew that there was potentials for issues there. Especially, I just I didn't have the resources to do any sort of testing for my own home grow. which I was providing for myself, my partner, my parents friends, like it was just whoever wanted some, they could come and get it. I had way more than I needed at that point, because I had really upped my knowledge in my game to the point where I was able to, I think at that point I was growing in like a 4x8 tent, a 4x5 tent, and
Oh, wow.
a little 1x2 tent, or like 1.5 by 2 foot tent. So it was like I had my clone tent, I had my veg tent, and I had my flower tent, and that flower tent was just pumping. It was, putting out a harvest every 65 to 70 days and just going right back into it.
Yep.
And so when the place right prior to where I'm working now was like a combination of organics and synthetics, and it was a lot of moving heavy pots again. And I was just like, I can't do this. I'm in my 30s now, and I'm going to start to hurt from just doing all of this extreme manual labor that I just wasn't used to. And so I found a place that was all hydroponics, and it had the whole thing set up. We have dosatrons to dose batch tanks in each room. Each room has hydrostatic pumps with solenoids. We're feeding each zone in each room through a software system that controls those solenoids. We're running drain to waste. We're experimenting with different cloning substrates, different vegging substrates, different flowering substrates. We're mixing up different, we're experimenting with different delivery methods. We were experimenting with different nutrient mixes as well, like just different brands. I think we started with like front row ag, then we went to using like a combination of front row ag and Athena. Then we went to JR Crop Tech, which is an amazing fertilizer company. They're probably my favorite for the simplicity of it. And then we're now using a combination of JR Crop Tech and Drip Hydro, and both just working tremendously. And you said 3.0 EC worries you, and
yes,
I'm going to now worry you a little bit more. We run our entire program at 4.0 or greater.
That just at face value seems insane. Like the plants would just burn to a crisp. Obviously they're not, so I'm just going to be quiet and listen.
Right. So my boss is a very intelligent individual. I feel like his level of research and dedication to expanding his knowledge on the plant is one of the reasons why I love working for this company, because it has provided me with such a greater level of understanding to this plant than I felt like I could have achieved outside of this work environment. And so, it's a pleasure to work there, because I always am learning. And there's stresses to that as well, because we're always putting in new lights, we're putting in new dehumidification systems, we're trying different combinations of irrigation practices with new substrate hydration protocols or maintenance protocols, all these different things that are really fascinating. But like I just hit one of the best yields that I've ever hit in my life. And it was like, we're pretty sure that it's going to be greater than 3 pounds per 4x4 area of A buds.
Wow.
And I'm super stoked on that. But
that would be awesome to replicate and scale. That would be amazing.
So this is kind of the that testing ground for a lot of these things. We have different rooms that run different parameters just based on the equipment that's in there. We use a couple different types of lights, and we also implement under canopy lighting. Combined with different pruning methods to achieve these results. And that's, we've found that like a greater than 4.0 EC, it provides such a great level of nutrient assimilation in the plant, or ability for nutrient assimilation in the plant, where you don't skip any beats on photosynthesis or metabolic processes. And The terpene profiles we've found have a longer shelf life because we're pretty sure that the cellular structure of the plant is healthier and more robust. And so you don't have the degradation of terpenes through oxidation as quickly or through just degradation as quickly. And so, some of the stuff that I've smoked from what we're growing, I'll smoke it, at month 1 after harvest. It's great. Beautiful example of the terpenes. I'll smoke it at month 6 and it's great. Beautiful example of the terpenes. Starts to go downhill around 8 to 9 months later. But, an 8 to 9 months shelf life for quality terpenes, especially when you're grinding it up, opening it up, getting that fresh bouquet of terpenes, that's super impressive to me because there's not a lot of cannabis that I've remember trying that was old cannabis that I was excited about.
Yeah, obviously, and this too, storage has a lot to do with it.
Yep.
Some terpenes are easier to keep around than others. Sesquiterpenes tend to just kind of a little bit easier than some monoterpenes. I love the fact that I'm hearing you guys are doing a lot of R&D, because that is not easy to do, and not many people are doing it in this environment because the margins are so thin. You need to meet X amount of goals. The farmer's thing is like, I want something new but proven, which is an oxymoron, but that's how you get there. So, hats off to that person. Ultimately, that's who's going to survive the longest, I think, is by people who are finding different ways of doing things, different approaches. My audio engineering teacher taught me you need to know the rules to break the rules, because once you know how everything works, then you can manipulate them to get the results that you want. So I think that's great that you guys are doing the R&D there. Not too many things at one time, because again, that's new grower folly. Is I changed 10 things and it turned out great. What of the 10 was it? But that brings me to, oh, go ahead.
Within what you were just saying, you have to know the rules before you can break them. Once you do have enough of a basis of knowledge of how certain reactions take place in the plants, right? So if you do change one thing and you see a reaction take place, you can associate it with that one thing. And then if you do something else and you change it and you see another reaction occur, then you can associate with that thing. And then, all the way down the line, you've done that for 20, 30, 40 different things. And then you can start to implement them at the same time and watch how they work in concert with each other.
Yeah.
And that's a whole new reaction that you can then quantify and qualify. And so having that basis of the one by one, a lot of people think it's a struggle and a pain, but it gives you so much more room for experimentation in the future because you have multiple pathways of association that you can take.
It's an excellent point. Excellent point there. That was bringing me around to the $1 million question. And I'm an audiophile. I'm an audio guy. But when it comes to flower, do you notice the difference between your hydroponic crops or your organic crops?
Yeah,
or
absolutely.
The crops? Okay. And how does, what do you mean by yes, absolutely? What about them are different?
Well, let's just go just within one cultivar that we've grown 10 different times. Every different time is a different batch, and each batch presents differently. You may have a more robust terpene profile on one, or you may have a more desirable flower structure on one, or a representation of that morphology. One of the ones that we've been growing now for a while that we hunted in house is beach grapes cut. Beach grapes being bred by Oni Seeds, and it's a cross of, I believe, like trop cookies and grape something. I don't remember, but it's an amazing cut. It smells like Welch's grape juice, but with a lot of like fuely, gassy, like sort of that what a lot of people are looking for today when they talk about like candy gas. It's like grape candy gas is what I like to describe it as. And it's really tasty. Yeah. And so we've seen different morphologies of the plant based on the irrigation practices, especially during the bulking phase where you're adding in the the phase 2 irrigations for maintenance, where you're maintaining the substrate water content up to a certain point so that you can achieve that controlled dryback like you were talking about earlier in the show. So you can control that with more irrigations or less irrigations, right? And so we've tried out different strategies there and achieved different results based on the flower morphology, the trichome density, the and just like the overall flavor expression, I guess. And then we've also seen different expressions, especially in terms of flowering time based on irrigation and environmental practices, as well as light quality.
Okay.
So we have some rooms that are an LED company. It's called EST Tech, and their original, they call them their halos. They're their bar style LED, but they have lenses on them, and they were built, purpose built to replicate an HPS spectrum.
Okay.
And this was, I think they came out with them like right around the same time that LED growers were switching, or HPS growers were heavily switching over to LEDs. So it made a lot of sense. But now we have another company that we're using called Spec Grade LED, and their lights are a lot bluer. So
Okay.
they really, to me, they mimic like what I feel like daylight looks like. Have you ever been in a grow space with a green light, and then you go outside of that green light grow space back to normal sunlight or something, and everything looks kind of off color, like pinkish, reddish? So I get that, like, kind of going from sunlight into these HPS rooms, there's always this like time of adjustment where I'm perceiving colors slightly differently. But if I go into this spec grade room, everything looks like it does outside. All the greens are the same green. All the, purples are the same purples that I would expect to see under sunlight. And the plants in there, they tend to finish faster, in my opinion. And I know that there is a lot of anecdotal evidence from the old double-ended days where people would go from HPS to CMH to finish their flowers, going from red to blue. So there seems to be some validity that's even following through in the same sort of idea here. But then also with the heavier blue lighting, we see far less stretch in the plants. So the like fraction of red and far red is so much lesser that it just doesn't have the same cellular elongation that you would get under these HPS spectrum LEDs. And the colors come through at the end tremendously without having to adjust the temperatures down too far, which is really cool. So, and then one of the things that you mentioned before that I wanted to touch back on was you said you see red stemming happening a lot with plants that are overwatered. And I think that has a lot to do with temperature. Because when you overwater plants, the roots are not only staying wet, but because of the thermal properties of water, it cools the roots greater than what the roots are potentially like stoked about. And
absolutely, I would go with that too, with temperature, because that'll help control the uptake too. Again, back to the transpiration. The warmer it is, the more it will. But when it's cooler, that water isn't moving as fast.
For sure. And then with some of the under canopy rooms, we also tend to see a lot of increase in flowering speed, or shortening of the flowering time with these under canopy lights that have a high fraction of far red lighting. And so not only are we seeing the plants sort of ripen faster with that, but because of one of the biggest things that I've seen with far red lighting and adding it to a grow with LED lights is all of the petioles stay green. All of the stems stay green. You don't get this striping or purpling of the petioles or stems. And we're thinking that it has to do with certain photosynthetic pathways, like the different photosynthetic receptors in the plant, since there's two different kinds, and some capture certain spectrum of light and the other capture the rest of the spectrum of light, all being within the BPAR, the biologically photosynthetically active radiation. So there's something there with the red lighting, and it also, I've seen just like different effects. It seems to increase the or decrease the flowering time as well, being added either throughout the whole flowering cycle, so you get that sort of Emerson effect,
Mm-hmm.
as well as if you're running it prior or after your actual light cycle. It seems to do something, and I know that there's a heavy debate about it, and I don't want to say, oh, it absolutely does this or that, but we're seeing healthier plants that are finishing where we want them to finish in a time space that we want them to finish in. So it seems to help with consistency.
Which is the goal of any commercial operation. Consistency is good, and cutting down time is great. And just the red and the blue spectrum, that's really how we wound up with those blurple lights, is
Yeah.
because red has its advantages, again, kind of like quicker onset of flowering, promotes that, but it also promotes the stem elongation, whereas blue was typically used in veg, keeps things a little bit shorter, a little bit more compact, but we ditched that for the HPS and the red and the kind of the warmer yellows in flower. Um, and then LEDs came in, and now we have the white light. The LEDs you were mentioning, are they a tunable spectrum, or they're
uh,
fixed?
they're fixed. We
Okay.
have tried out a tunable spectrum. We tried out the what is it, the Science LED
Mhm.
Raging Kush or something, their
Yeah,
bar style
yeah,
LED.
yeah,
And they're a really fascinating product, and I feel as though I've seen some newer ones that are uh, still trying out this tunable spectrum. um, I think that there's something to it, but I think that it's less than what people say, and I feel like there's really only certain applications for it to actually have a measurable change, other than it's just
yeah,
being something like, oh, I just kind of give it this recipe and that's my recipe, so my flour always turns out my flour. I'm like, that's cool and all, but that, like, what are you, how are you quantifying that change? And is it something that is actually worth your while? Is it creating something that is, greater in a specific terpene profile? If so, that's
yeah,
interesting, and it should be something that's researched. Or in is the fraction of cannabis or cannabinoids adjusted, right? Is the
yeah.
CBD to THC ratio adjusted? Or yeah, I mean, like, it's interesting, but I feel like there's not enough information out there. I feel like so many of these things just put up against that, like, dichotomous, does it do this or doesn't it? And
Hmm.
so they don't necessarily test the rest of what it is doing. Like, I hear a lot of people say far red light doesn't decrease your flowering time, and it's proven because someone like Bruce Bugby says so. And I'm like, that's great, but it does do something. And to just say that it
Yes.
doesn't do this, I feel like it disqualifies it from further research when you're an authority figure and saying
Hmm.
it doesn't do this, it's not worth it. Well, but what is it worth then? Because it's doing
Right.
something. I'm seeing it. I it's the only thing I've changed. I didn't change anything else, and it's doing something. If it's as little as making the petioles green,
Hmm.
something happened in the plant. Some metabolic pathway changed. Some nutrient assimilation changed. What is it? We should be able to quantify this and qualify it and know what it's doing in the plant. But to just say it doesn't do this, it's not worth adding,
Right.
I start to be very skeptical about that.
Yeah, I'm almost wondering if the red light and keeping the petioles green, I wonder if it's just because there's more cellular division, there's more growth, maybe it doesn't have time. Things that we cannot answer right now, but we'll keep getting to it. And to Bruce Bugby, he is a person I point to a lot, but I also caveat that with he is in the institutional science, and that is the same people that want new but proven. Like
Sure.
they are the last to usually publicly accept it, because they need such an overwhelming amount of evidence to institutionally say, yes, this is where it is. They'll
For sure.
accept the anecdotal stuff, but that's where, you know, the community and a lot of other researchers can pull ahead sometimes of academia, because we're not as rigid. We can see the writing on the wall sooner.
Right.
But yeah, he is a great person, but I have watched videos specifically on that topic with him, and it's a conflicting answer to what people I trust in their grows have seen as well. So
Right.
maybe he'll come around to that.
And one of the
What
things there too is the like, we know as growers that the drug varietals of cannabis are vastly different and have very different
Mhm.
responses to different
True.
inputs and
Very true.
adjustments. And if you've never grown a drug cannabis before, how can you say or know for sure that it does or doesn't affect things? Just like with these under canopy lights, it's a new thing that people are implementing. It doesn't work for all cultivars. Some cultivars do not do well with under canopy lights. It is not a fix-all for an increase in yield for a plant that just does a
Nice.
lot better if you need to veg it longer and then prune it very high. Sometimes the plants just can't redistribute that energy into creating those quality flowers that you're desiring by adding the under canopy lights. I'm sorry I interrupted you, but I felt like that was just one thing I wanted to make sure I touched on.
I appreciate that, because that is the next kind of like subject I want to dive into. There, you know, the two things is the far red, and then maybe we could get back to the underlighting, because I have my opinions on that too. But so far red, typically you're adding just like supplemental strips, and you're adding in the far red. I always get asked, what is your timing? Do you run it all day? Do you run it kind of like the Emerson effect, like 15 minutes before and then 15 minutes after light out? Like, I've never had a solid answer to that, because again,
For sure.
I can look online what other people are doing. I can do things here, but it is hard for me to quantify that without cannabinoid testing. Did I maybe boost my biomass, but yet my cannabinoids are now lacking?
Right.
Um, so as far as timing though, what are you guys doing, or what have you found that works good for those like supplemental far red strips? Is it on all day, or how do you approach that?
So I've approached it in a couple different ways. Um, we don't have at the commercial facility the ability to add overhead far red lighting that is independent of the other lighting that we have, except in one room and in half of that room. So I do have some anecdotal evidence from there. And what we do see is that the plants tend to mature faster, the petioles stay greener, and we can see this next to the exact same crop on the other half of the room.
Right.
So there's something there. Um, we,
And so
I haven't,
that would be on all day though, because it's
so, oh,
fixed into the
sorry.
lights.
So that actually we do have the ability to control. It's just that one part of the one room that we have the ability to control, and we run it for 7 minutes at lights off.
Okay.
So
Minimal.
if you're yeah, very minimal, not a lot. um, Doing too much more does create a sort of elongation effect, and so yeah, too much far red may not help, especially if you're trying to control your canopy height. um, we are running a combination of far and near red in the under canopy lights, just because a lot of the different producers of under canopy lights added that as a larger fraction to it based on their trials. And it does, and it runs all day. And so that does seem to also do the same thing. It seems to makes the stems a lot greener. Sometimes the areas that are right next to the lights get blasted because they're sometimes only like an inch or two away, and those parts of the plants will sometimes turn red. But when we've added the additional overhead red lighting at lights off, they don't.
Wow.
So it's so
Interesting.
it's it's really weird and interesting. Sometimes they still do develop it later in life, but uh, from all the research I've done, it's just a photosynthetic response to prevent burning of the cellular tissue.
Yeah.
And so it's like it acts as its own sunscreen. But we've known that about anthocyanins for a long time in plants. Um, and so when I have tried this far red at home, because I got a couple little like far red pucks, just threw them in where my grow space was, and that I would run at 7 minutes before the lights come on and 7 minutes after the lights go off. And that has all the plant is green all the way through. The flowers will still purple out, and the senescence will occur about 3 to 4 days sooner than I've seen the same cultivar start to senesce without this far red lighting in a very similar growing environment. And now I can't, account for every single environmental factor, as well as every single substrate factor that might push a generative response over a vegetative response that would decrease that flowering time. But all things else being the same, it does seem to decrease the overall flowering time. It's only by like 4 or 5 days, but if you're in a commercial setting, 4 or 5 days over a year turns into 25 days of extra time. After 2 years, that's pretty darn close to a whole nother flowering cycle with the same amount of input energy. So it's something that it needs to be looked into a lot more, and it needs to be looked into people with a lot better monitoring equipment than I have.
Well, again, it all starts at this level and continues to pile up, and you're making me want to dig out my far red bars and give this 7 minutes a try.
Do it.
I'm glad that you kind of compounded the time, because 3 to 4 days to some people, home grower in particular, like, okay, what's the difference? The lights themselves aren't really expensive. If you're running it for that short of the time, you're not adding much to the electricity bill. But where it does really come in handy, as you mentioned, by compounding the time, is just more harvests per year, or every couple of years. That's why I honestly choose flowering times that I choose, because I want a set number of harvests per year.
For sure.
That's just how I operate. And luckily for me, I find things that I like and work effectively within that time range. So I can go outside of them. But I don't, oh gosh, as much as I love to smoke the 12 to 14 weekers, I do not want to grow them. I'm sorry, I'm part of the problem, but I will happily pay for good representations. So I make up for it that way.
Any sane commercial grower isn't growing equatorial sativa either, because you can't charge more for a pound of sativa than you can a pound of indica, if you're using the two terms dichotomously. But the spectrum is a lot bigger than that. But if we're trying to simplify it, you can't charge more for something that flowers longer, unless you're in like a niche market and selling pre-packaged eighths or ounces for an astronomical price because you have some like special brand, right, that everyone wants. I've seen it happens, but it's not typical.
Mm-hmm. No, and I always applaud the Dutch for their old system in the coffee shops. It's basically the price you got was based upon the weeks that flowered. So that's why
nice.
A lot of the well, the
shows care
system's
for the
changing.
grower.
It does. I mean, we're spreading our American cannabis system all across the world, so that things have changed there now significantly, and we see that with the influx of the companies moving here. I mean, they made a huge splash last year at MJ BizCon. You got Sensi Seeds, you got Greenhouse, you got ILGM. Guess what? They are now one company. They merged. They're going to be listed on the stock exchange. So home growers, get prepared for that. Find your good breeders now. I will get off of that one. Another thing, though, that kind of tends to come up in the conversation around like far red light or like Emerson effect, it's distinctly different, but UV typically is part of that supplemental lighting conversation. Again, if you look at Bruce Bugby, the jury's still out. Jury seems to be out, but there's anecdotal evidence. Is UV anything that you guys have experimented with there? And do you have any results or opinions on adding UV to, and I guess I should clarify, adding UV is meant to increase trichome heads, which increases cannabinoids and terpenes. Sure. That's what's stored in there. So do you guys have any experience with that?
Yes, but I've never seen it do what it's claimed to do.
Okay, fair.
I think I think for UV, the best application is going to be a sterilization
Yeah. Okay.
application.
Yeah.
So I know like the Dutch will use a lot of UVC applicators in their large glass houses where they will just run them over the crops to help reduce pest and pathogen pressures. And,
Run water
in that
through it.
sense, yeah, it works. Yeah, running water through it for water sterilization. Like there are applications for UVC lighting. UVA and B, there might be some applications for it, but again, it's something that I don't feel as though there's like any anecdotal evidence has never been replicated. And so I feel like the ability to repeat an experiment is the only way to proof it out. I mean, that is the scientific process, but um, yeah, I've never seen it actually work in like by increasing trichome density or creating a larger fraction of cannabis to plant matter in the final product. Maybe it does, but also like
Right.
UVC lighting, there's like I think the fraction of UVC lighting is negligible that comes from the sun because the
Mm.
ozone layer filters it out. And so like plants aren't getting UVC in any fraction high enough in nature to warrant the use of it outside of that scenario. Sometimes things we apply that don't happen in nature, that happen in a grow room, have a really good effect, but it's been tried and tested and proven. And I just don't see that with UVC. UVA and B though, that's where I'm like, maybe it does something. Maybe it increases the cellular wall,
Defenses
thickness.
or something, like it's under attack, or
Yeah, like
who
maybe it
knows.
reduces pest and pathogen pressure. Maybe it increases a thicker lipid wall on the trichome heads that creates not necessarily a more robust cannabis or terpene profile, but something that lasts longer. Who knows? These are all things that need a lot more research into.
They do.
Jury's
And
out,
again,
you know.
yeah, jury's out. Sure, fair enough. And that's exactly where I sit too. I'm in the middle. I don't have anything that's just like it's absolutely destructive, never use it, or it's absolutely beneficial. Obviously, I'll definitely use it. So, jury's out. But having the experience in the background and just the inquisitive mind that I have, I've been around like growing cannabis for a really long time, long enough to see things come and go, things praised
Mhm.
as the next must haves, the absolutely has to do. And that's sometimes I enter like those, UV with a bit of skepticism. I'm not from Missouri, but show me. Uh, because I want to see results. Kangen
Sure.
water is one of those that I can easily point to of like everybody has to have it. You must use it. It is the best thing. It's going to save all commercial grows. It was the talk of the town 3 years ago, 4 years ago. Who's talking about it now? So that's where I do come in with some skepticism to some things, and I need to go run and grab my battery charger. But I want to get into under canopy here real quick.
Sure.
So the under canopy lighting. This is one that let's just, at least through my mind, take it at face value.
Sure.
We all know that the buds underneath the canopy aren't receiving the same amount of PPFD. So we can probably all agree that they're underlit. And just simply by adding lighting, you're increasing the PPFD, which is increasing its ability to grow. So at face value, duh, underlighting canopy should help a little bit. But is it worth, is the juice worth the squeeze? Because a added electricity at the home grower level, it's not significant. Commercially, yeah, that's going to add up. But you also, the one thing that I've struggled with is having to maneuver around it in the cord. So I guess, what has the experience been with there for under canopy lighting? Because I've done about this much trialing of it, so
For sure.
not as
So
large in size.
I mean, so it takes planning. because it can be a pain in the butt to move under canopy lights in, let's say after you already have trellis in place,
Yeah.
or even after you have plants in place. So what I've come up with is like, the way that I like to do this is in a commercial setting, right? And this can be the same all the way down to a 4x4 tent. If you're running hydroponics with a table, you can follow these same protocols. You clean the room, you sanitize it, you clean your reservoirs, you sanitize it, you sanitize all your irrigation lines, get everything, sparkling, ready to be, licked. And then you move your under canopy lights in and you get them in place. Then you put all your plants in and you start your round. And now, depending on the plants, you want to apply these under canopy lights. You want to apply them based on the structure of the plant. So starting them early helps for plants that stay really stout. If you're starting them early because you want to help develop those lower bud sites early, and I feel like everyone's seen, by day 21, 25, once you have all of your flower set complete and the stretch is done, the flowers at the top of the plant are the biggest. They have the most robust calyx and bract production, and all the white hairs are sticking out. Then you get all the way down to those flower sites at the bottom of the plant, and they might have like 1 bract, 2 bracts, 5, 6 white hairs. We're up here, you can't even count the white hairs, right? So depending on the structure of the plant, right? Because you still do need to apply some pruning. You want to make sure that you're pruning up past where the lights are so that, all the flower sites are receiving light. You want to make sure that you're removing leaves like you normally would, just to make sure that you have adequate airflow, as well as the light penetration can go all the way through the canopy. So starting early with plants that are squat, that are bushy, I see help, because it does also, by providing the extra red light, you're providing cell elongation, so you can help make these plants a little bit taller, and the internodal spacing is a little bigger, especially for things that get really tightly packed. That way you can avoid certain like botrytis and pathogens. So applying early for the squat plants, applying around day 4 or 5 for the taller plants, so you let them stretch up a little bit so that you can start the lights, remove the leaves that are going to be touching the lights, and start them on their journey. I always prune once the stretch is over. It helps me see where the plant's going to end up. Pruning early can prolong the stretch and flower set due to the stress that it's causing on the plant. And so by getting to that final flower set, you start to remove your leaves, your branches and stuff. And a couple things to consider with your under canopy lights. You want to make sure that you're stepping them up in percentage at a very slow rate, similar to how you would with your overhead lights. You don't want to slam your plants with too much light, causing their photosynthetic processes to hiccup or slow down or run into issues. Typically, like if you're running an overhead light that has 650 or more watts of draw, you're stepping that up by like 5% every day, perhaps. This is where I find 5% every day or every other day, depending on how they respond, is my go-to. Versus the under canopy lights, they're usually around 120 watts a piece, and you're adding 2 of them, maybe 3, if that's your style, to that one 4x4 area. And so, if you're at 240 watts with 2 of them, then you can usually step that up by like 10% every day, but still starting really low. Like with the overhead canopy lights, I start it around the same percentage that I am moving out of the veg space with, just so that they get around the same PPFD, even though they're going to have a smaller DLI, because you're removing 6 hours of light. The PPFD is still the driving force on the plant, and if you increase that, the plant has to respond, and that can cause some issues, I've found. So you have to start really low with the under canopy lights when you do start them, because it is going to provide all this extra photosynthetically available light to the plant that's going to potentially shock its photocell system. And so by applying it like at a low and then raising it up with the overhead lights, by around day 20 to 25, everything should be at capacity for what your environment can handle. Because some people don't have the ability to run their lights at 100% based on their dehumidification and air conditioning capacity, more specific to air conditioning capacity. Or even if you're just using a tent with air exchange, all that added BTU to that small space, you're going to have to increase your air exchange depending on where your tent is located. If you're pulling in warm air, well, then that might be a problem. If you're pulling in cold air, maybe you want to make sure you're not pulling in too much, or that you're regulating it as only running at a certain speed during the day to remove that extra heat, but slowing it down at night to maintain a more comfortable environment for the plants. There's a lot of things to consider because you are adding more heat to the room, you're adding more light to the room, and a lot of processes like the pruning and defoliation need to be adjusted.
Absolutely. Because, one thing that I see with that, just based off of, because, I have like the sustainable ag and small farm systems background. And I was doing school when this vertical farming was really the big thing. Everybody was dumping millions and billions into vertical farming, just traditional products. And one of the things since then that has kind of tripped up that industry, or at least that approach, was the creation of different microclimates. And, we always say, monitor at the top of your canopy, make sure you're moving air at the top of the canopy. And I always say, make sure you're moving air underneath the canopy. But that under canopy, based on your defoliation and pruning techniques, can also act as a trap for that additional heat, the BTUs, as you mentioned. And again, not having the personal experience with it on a large level, I wonder if people are monitoring both that microclimate above and below with the underlighting, and if they are, if that under canopy temperature actually exceeds or has the potential to exceed what's above, because that to me would just kind of sound like a risk factor for molds or bud rot.
For sure. And one of the big things I'm going to say, and I know that this might be a little bit of a cop-out, but it is, I feel like, also an important factor that all growers should consider, is that if you need to measure your temperature and humidity in multiple spots, then you do not have adequate airflow through the system.
Damn it, fair. Damn it, that's fair. So I mean, I'm always putting myself.
That's why you have to make all these adjustments, right?
Yeah, right. That's true. Because I'm always thinking, confined small areas. Commercially things are harder and easier at the same time. Harder. Or easier because there is a lot more open space for the open airflow versus the confined 4x4, or maybe even smaller. You can set your lights high. You don't necessarily have to adjust them because you get all the overlap. And so you're not like losing as much. There's not as much diffusion.
Sure. Well, I think one thing that people need to consider also is thermodynamics in general. And I feel like it's not talked about enough in a way that needs to be applied in especially a tent grow where you're using air exchange. And to know, heat rises, cold air sinks. The heat that you're producing in your tent is at the greatest at the top of your tent. So the heat is always going to rest at the top of your tent. Now, you need to break that heat pocket up with air movement. You also want to add cool air to cool down that extra heat, and you need to remove air to remove that extra heat. And I feel like one of the things that I see a lot of people struggle with is they're adding cold air at the bottom of the tent as their intake, and they're exhausting hot air out of the top of the tent as their exhaust. That means you have a hot pocket up top and a cold pocket down low always.
Right.
I've found that the greatest success is pulling cold air in over the top of the light and exhausting the mixed air out of the bottom of the tent. And that way, that's where I say you need to have enough adequate airflow through the tent system to mix that hot air that's up at the top of the tent, so that by the time the air is getting pulled out of the bottom, that's your homogenized mix, and that's what's moving down through the canopy. Because you're putting that cold air at the top, right?
Yeah.
So it's going to mix with the hot air. That temperate air is going to then be pushed down below the heat that's being produced by the light. That temperate air is going to move through the canopy, carrying all of the excess humidity that's being expired
right
by the expiration process, the transpiration process of the plant, and being then pulled out down through that lower exhaust with the cold air that's at the bottom of the tent.
Yeah. See, you've got me sitting sideways now, because it's absolutely contrary to everything that we're told as far as when you're starting to grow, how to position things, where to set things up, why you set things up. But once again, the logic in your explanation absolutely rings true to me. Now,
thermodynamics, man.
I mean, in practice, it'll be interesting. I think I'm going to set up a tent that way tonight. I've never done that before.
It's how I had a huge problem with mold in my plants, and it always started at the bottom of the tent, because that's your coldest and wettest air.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Usually so.
Because by the felt humidity of the plants, because your humidity in the tent is actually going to stay fairly homogeneous, right? So the relative humidity in that colder temperature is going to be greater than the relative humidity at the hotter temperature, right? Just because hot air can hold more moisture, so the relative amount of moisture that it can hold is lesser, even considering the absolute humidity is higher, right? So moving that air around the top and then pulling it down through the canopy provides, because especially you want to make sure then that you're measuring right at the top of the canopy your relative humidity and temperatures, because that's what's then being pulled down through the canopy.
Wow. Interesting. I'm glad you mentioned that, because you've got me thinking now. And I bet you've got a lot of other people thinking too about all kinds of things. We've touched on some really good topics, things that come up often, because I don't think there really is the set definitive answers or rules on the things like the far red, on the underlighting canopy, on the UV, thermodynamics. Gosh, does this mean I'm going to have to go back and write all my tutorial articles? I don't know, but I'm going to try it. I'm going to see what happens. I'm going to see what we like it. Because again, I get the feeling you're like me, maybe a little bit of a data nerd. I love my data. We still have to use our eyes, but data can guide us in directions. So I like that one. One other thing too you mentioned was the intensity of the underlighting, and how you kind of want to gradually step that up based on kind of height, pruning, and age. But one thing that I have not seen, and again, I haven't looked extensively for underlighting. I do have some Spider Farmer side lighting that I've used, but I've never seen anything that comes with like a dimmer or something that I can control the intensity. It's either all or nothing. So are you guys working with something that does come on a dimmer, or are you familiar with one, or how do you maybe ramp that stuff up?
For sure. So we all of the lighting that we use has like a 0 to 10 volt dimmer on it, and it just means you're like sending a signal that's somewhere between 0 and 10 volts. Every decimal, or every volt is 10 decimal places, so you can go, sometimes they only step up in the decimal place, some of them go to the fraction, so you have like some of them you can control down to the 1%, some of them you control by the 5%, the 10%. Most of the modern lights, though, they can control, they'll control like potentially maybe down to only like 40% or something, or 30%, and then from there you can control it 31, 32, 33, 34, 35, just by sending these signals over. And we just use a controller for that. Most lighting companies have a controller that's dedicated to their light, but if it's a 0 to 10 volt requirement, you can find a bunch of them. Some of them a lot cheaper
Okay.
than others, and some a lot more functional than others. But yeah,
Right.
we control it every day, just kind of going in, getting over to the percentage, up in the percentage a little bit, and
Okay.
going from there.
So is it? Let's see if I'm picturing this right. It's almost kind of like the old school fan speed controllers. Like the fan itself and the plug itself didn't actually have a speed controller with it, but you could wire one into it and then you can control it that way.
So these are actually wired for control.
Okay, they come
So
from the factory with it built in.
yeah, so normally
Okay,
like the
okay.
old lights, you usually have like a 3 prong for the
Hmm.
power, and these they'll have like 5 prongs. So you have your positive, negative terminal for electrical with the ground, and then you also have a ground and a 10 volt um,
Oh,
prong usually that are coming in, and those get wired separately. Like you'll have the power wire come out, and then a pigtail of like the 0 to 10 volt wire come out.
okay.
Sometimes it's just like a cat 5e, like
Hmm.
a an ethernet
Like the
cable
phone
that
jack
comes
cord.
out.
Yeah. I'm
Sometimes it's
old.
just a black and white, wire that you then can either wire into a Cat 5e, or you can wire it into, sometimes they just have a positive and a negative terminal on the controller. There's a whole bunch of different controllers out there. And the standard seems to be 0 to 10 volt control. Sometimes it it receives the pulse from the light, so the light creates the pulse. So if the light's not on, it doesn't create this dimming effect. Sometimes it comes from the controller. The controller sends the pulse to the light, but there's a whole bunch of different ones out there.
Man, that's okay. I'm gonna have to go in and look at some of those things too. You're giving me a bunch of homework to do here, Nick. What the hell, man? Got to change
But
my
if I
tent configurations. Got to.
I'll do a couple shout outs though, because the best under canopy lights that I've found success with so far are the ones from Craft Farmer. They're solid. They're like bulletproof. You can drop them and they still work. Um,
Nice.
then the
And
next
they've got to
ones,
be waterproof, man. They've got to be waterproof because you are
they
spilling on your under canopy lights. I don't care how careful
I
you
spray
are,
them.
you're spilling on them. Yeah,
I
there you
straight
go.
spray them with a hose. They're fine. And the craft farmers are really nice because they the the daisy chaining ability, they
Hmm.
just lock right into it. One end of one has the male fitting, and
Nice.
the other end of it is the female fitting. They just lock right in, and they have 2 O-rings, like gaskets for sealing them, and they're sealed, and they just line right up. Because if you're running them down a table, either that, or then they also have like a coupling cable if you need to just run like one small area with 2 of them. And then they also have a faceplate that goes over with the same gasket, so that you can close it, terminate the daisy chain in a water safe way.
Cap it.
And
Yeah.
they're bulletproof, those. And then the ion under canopy lights from Grow Generation work really
Okay.
well, and they're also like very easy to install. They have awesome stands. The connectors on them are really nice. And then also like Faven lighting, I've heard is great, and a bunch of companies are now coming out with under canopy lights just because of the demand for them in the market. But honestly, like the usability of the craft farmer ones are so far hands down the easiest to install, easiest to use. They work with any 0 to 10 volt controller, and I'm not sponsored by them or anything. I like it when I get a
Yep.
product that's easy to use as a grower, because there's so many products that I think are made by or for growers but not by growers, that
Looks good
you
on
end up
paper,
running
but
in.
not in practice.
Oh no,
Yeah.
you like run into like this doesn't actually work. It's, you say it fits in a 4 foot tent, but the connectors on the end add an additional 6 inches total.
Yeah.
Now my tent has these bulgy nipples on either end that I'm going to run into. I might knock something over in there without knowing. So yeah,
Yep.
functionality for sure. It is so important.
And the craft farmer looks great. I just pulled it up real quick here on the other screen. It almost looks like I could turn it into a grind bar for skateboarding, little rail
You
slide.
probably
So
could. You probably could. Yeah, they're built
it's a
pretty
product video.
bulletproof. But I love that he just like goes really hype with his marketing and stuff too. It's like it's a fun marketing rather than it being so technical and stuff. but they work so well that it's just like, oh, it's cool to not see it be something that's so cookie cutter.
Yep. And this is, again, this is going to be one of my jury is still out on it, because I kind of, again, I approach things from starting to poo-poo it, but you can't really poo-poo anything until you try it yourself. I've done a little bit of research, but I also lack, well, again, controlled environment is an interesting thing, because in labs where you can keep things precise and sterile, that's not necessarily real world conditions, because there will be fluctuations from run to run. Um, but
So
I
I can
lack
tell you
the
for anecdotal
oh,
evidence, we've ran under canopy lights. So in one room, we had 3 tables. Each table had a different cultivar, and we only ran the under canopy lights on the front half of all 3 tables.
okay,
We run our plants in a 3x3 grid per 4x4 space, right? So 9 plants
okay,
per light is kind of the rough metric that we give out. Those 9 plants on average without the under canopy lights, strain to strain dependent, range from 900 grams wet whole weight plant up to 1200 grams per
wow,
plant. With the
wow,
under canopy lights, they range from around 1100 to 1200 to 1600 to 1700 grams per plant wet. Okay.
significant.
So that's significant, right? Now, the big thing with under canopy lights is we aren't necessarily yielding more weight out of each room. The final trimmed pounds
Mhm.
total are roughly the same. But rather than having 20% of those pounds be in small B popcorn buds, we
Okay,
only have about 5% of the total
okay,
weight going into bees. And this
fair.
changes cultivar to cultivar. I'm just throwing some numbers out there. They're not extremely accurate, and it's all situationally dependent. But what you can expect is a lower ratio of Bs to As, as
Okay,
well as a slight overall increase in yield.
okay.
Now,
That's
if you're looking at it from a commercial standpoint, right, and if you can sell Bs at 2/3 of the price as A's,
mhm.
you're increasing your profitability from each pound produced, from each pound of biomass grown.
Perfect way to frame that there, because again, a lot of the things, a lot of techniques that I say that growers will do at the home level, who cares about 2 or 3 extra grams per plant? It's not sometimes, okay, we found the person. But commercially, when you take that 2 to 3 grams and you times that by 10,000 plants, 20,000 plants, 30,000 plants, that is where it makes a huge impact. That's where it's
Sure.
absolutely something you would want to do. But sometimes that can also illustrate the divide of priorities versus a home or a commercial grower. And I'm glad you put it the way that you did, because sometimes, again, people are like, oh, more yield. Whenever I hear more yield, my next question is like, do you mean biomass or do you mean cannabinoids? And in your scenario, what you laid out is it's not necessarily biomass, but you are getting more usable or sellable products. And absolutely, A's versus B's, huge price difference. I would see why and where that makes sense.
Sure. And
So
then on top
go
of
ahead.
that, you're having a uniform right. So I feel like the main reason why you get this higher fraction of A's is not necessarily because, I mean, it's partially due to the fact that you're putting light at this part of the plant that doesn't receive as much PPFD generally, right?
Mhm.
So you're increasing the photosynthetic response to that area of the plant. I feel like everyone's seen this. When you harvest your plant, when the tops are perfect, the lowers are a little less done. They're not
Absolutely.
cooked,
Yep.
right?
Yep.
I've
Yep.
heard people say they just didn't get cooked as well. And so
Yep.
the top, right, you if especially in a purpling phenotype of a plant, if the tops purple out really nice, then you get down mid canopy where it was shaded and they start to
Mhm.
lose that coloring. when you're adding these under canopy lights, because a lot of the coloring response is a photosynthetic response, by increasing the photosynthesis in that lower part of the plant, you're increasing those photosynthetic responses as well. And so what on the same trial on this table, one of the cultivars was so obvious that the plants without under canopy lights, even the tops were greener, versus the plants with the under canopy lights, the entire plant ripened and senesced at a uniform pace and to a greater degree than the other plants, which also makes me think that the thought process of it ripening faster is very valid. But it was like a stark difference in color. Like we could, even after we dried and hung them, I could have taken those plants and mixed them up, and I could have taken just like our cultivator that helps with all this stuff, but doesn't necessarily have the same level of education in cannabis, and go in there and be like, boom, 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 under canopy plants, boom, 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 non under canopy plants. It was that stark of a difference.
And another thing commercially that is very important is a uniform crop. So if you go with one style, you got to kind of almost stick with it, because
exactly.
just for people who don't understand, distributors, if you're selling them, let's just say cookies, my favorite strain, it needs to all look the same. If you have half of your batch purple and half of the batch green, you can't really mix and match and then sell it as XYZ. So
purchasers will say those are two different packs. You need to repackage those. They're not the same plant. And it's like, well, yes, they are. And they're like, not when it comes to the customer, it isn't. They want to see purple weed in their jar. If they order purple weed, they don't want to see one purple nug and a green nug. They're going to think that we're putting something in there that isn't the same bud, even though we know as growers, no, it's the same plant. It just changed. The color is like a spectrum across the plant, top to bottom. It's not uniform. But you're right, uniformity being so key, that's where I feel like, you get a more uniform bud size, you get a more uniform trichome density, you get a more uniform coloring, and it just, if uniformity is your goal, under canopy lights are extremely helpful. There's so many aspects to it, including how the light quality of that under canopy light is designed. Does it have that higher fraction of red? Does it have more blue? Does it have UV? What's your total PPFD? Where it hits the under canopy. And one of the things that I've noticed with under canopy lighting too is some plants, because the photoreceptor cells in the actual plant cells are there's more photoreceptors on the top of the leaves than on the underside of the leaves. The underside of the leaves still can photosynthesize, but you'll get, and it looks like a nitrogen toxicity. You'll get a ram's horning effect, where the little sugar leaves and the leaves that are right next to the flowers will sort of hook down so that they present that glossy surface with more photosynthetic or photocell receptors facing those lights, because that's where the greatest portion of their PPFD is coming from now, rather than just coming down from the top. So you get some weird morphologies like that, but we've just found that it's just the plant's response to be able to utilize all of that extra light.
Yep, and I could be getting this wrong, but I think that it's a phototropic is the fancy term, because sometimes you'll see the leaf turn and shift
Sure, I think
to
you're
the
right.
light, and that's another reason too why when it's following the progression of the sun throughout the day, the morning is kind of leaning this way and the evening is kind of leaning this way, because it wants to go towards the light. So
it's like watching a time lapse of a field of sunflowers. That's always really fun.
Yeah, turn their heads. So I'm glad you brought that up, because that, for the uninitiated or unexperienced, maybe like, oh my gosh, what's wrong with my plant? Is this,
I thought it was nitrogen toxicity right off the bat. I'm like, that's nitrogen toxicity, but it wasn't all the way up the plant. And the top of the plant looked super healthy. And normally you would see it at the top of the plant because nitrogen is a mobile nutrient. So taking all those different aspects into account, it was actually my boss that was like, no, that's a photo response. That's not a nitrogen response. I'm like, oh my God, that makes so much more sense than it being a nitrogen response. It didn't make sense to be a nitrogen response. Everything was healthy before I turned the under canopy lights on. Why would there be a nitrogen toxicity if I'm increasing the photosynthetic rate of the plant? That doesn't make sense.
That's, yeah, again, 'cause the kind of like the signal flow. I always bring things back to audio. Signal flow. When it comes to anything, nutrients, that is one of the first things we want to look at. It, is it top of the plant? Is it the bottom of the plant? Is it all over the plant? Where is this happening? And like you just mentioned, mobile versus immobile nutrients, that can be our second move. And then we go from there. So just by knowing that, you could have, or well, you did kind of narrow in on the probable cause. But as any grower who suffered from, any deficiency, any type of pest problems, the second you see like a little sign or something on your leaf, you always go to the worst case scenario. Most people do. You're like, oh crap. But take a little bit of time, use the tools that you have, and you can diagnose it properly. And that's where, podcasts like this help, reaching out to other people. I always say we only get so many we can grow per year. But if we share our information, we share our knowledge, like you've shared a lot today, that's going to give people, years of experience just from taking a couple hours to listen to the podcast. And
Absolutely.
yeah, I mean, all kinds of great things to think about. We've touched some awesome subjects, things that are hot, things people like to talk about. We didn't even get into genetics. We didn't even get into tissue culture, things that I do want to dive into, but maybe we'll do this on a part 2. I don't know. Would you be willing to come back again and have another conversation with me?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, 2 hours
Awesome.
is usually where I try to like target my podcasts as well, because I feel like that's a nice time frame, especially for like educational material.
Yeah.
Um, I couldn't sit in a class for longer than 2 hours. I would probably go crazy. So, but this is, yeah, it's been super fun, and I'd be absolutely willing to come back for a part 2. We can get more into perhaps like some of the like crop steering practices or environmental and irrigation management practices, tissue culture. Um, we at this time of year we completely pivot our indoor from just indoor production to preparing for an outdoor season as well. So
Interesting.
we have 4 12 light indoor rooms, but we have so that's 48 lights of flowering space, but we have 36 lights of veg space and veg and mother space. And a lot of people say that's not the right ratio. And I go, well, it is when you have a library of over 120 different cultivars that you maintain, as well as a 2 acre plot that you provide all the clones for every year. And we typically do around 100 cultivars outdoor each year. So
Nice.
it is that's what we're doing right now. We're ramping up for that. um you know we'll probably get into it in the next episode, but tissue culture is going to play a huge part in that genetic library as well. There's a lot of applications there: reducing overhead, increasing the health, rejuvenation, pathogen prevention, reduction, and removal. Whole bunch of different things. And yeah, that'll be exciting, because I'll probably actually have some more news on an exciting project I might be able to talk about in a near
Ooh,
future that involves tissue culture. So yeah, that
that's
that
very
sounds
cool.
great.
And tissue culture, gosh, for like future proofing yourself, it's cool because it's entering the strictly professional realm into the advanced learner hobbyist level. Like, this is something we can start getting into for ourselves. I will save it for you to tell us of all the advantages plus what you've just mentioned there on the next one. But please let people know where they can find you in the meantime. Are you on Instagram? How about the YouTube channel? Where can people go and find you to hear more? Because again, that's why I love watching your show. You
Sure.
interject a lot of your own experience and it's applicable.
For sure. Well, so for my like sort of professional work as well as my social media presence, you can find me at Mr. Wolf Grows, and that's Wolf with an E. And you can find that on YouTube, Reddit, Instagram. And then the podcast project that I'm working on is part of the Craft Growers Network, which you can find on YouTube, Spotify, or Apple Podcasts, or pretty much anywhere that you get the podcasts that you like to listen to. We have like our RSS feed set up so that it should reach out everywhere.
Populate.
And the specific show that I host is called The Way We Grow, and you can find The Way We Grow podcast or at The Way We Grow podcast on Instagram. You can also find it's at Craft Growers Network on Instagram. My partner, Gabby Staten Island, in that project. You can also find him over there. I'll give a huge shout out to him. And he's at SI Gabby Chemdog on Instagram.
Yeah. He keeps losing his Instagram, so it may change. But
it may change. He has a bunch of them set up there. If you look up Gabby Sour, Gabby Staten Island, you'll be able to find him. But the Craft Growers Network, that's our project together. And that's
cool.
Those are about my shout outs. Oh, and if you want to look into like the commercial space that I work for, it's at TA Cultivators. Terra Australis is the name of the company, but you can find them at TA Cultivators on Instagram as well.
Cool. Well, next time I am down in your state, I will look for it. Sorry, Washington, but Oregon grows better weed. I don't know what to say about that, but they do.
We white label most of our product now, so you might not actually be able to find it specifically, but you can find all of our concentrates that we do outdoors under the label of Grown. So a lot of the Grown concentrates in Oregon are grown by us at TA Cultivators. They usually label it on the product as such as well.
Fantastic. Well, Nick, this has been fun, man. Thank you again for joining me today, and everybody for watching. Thank you for hanging out in chat. Thank you for being part of the conversation and enjoying yourself. All of his contact info that were just mentioned are down in the show notes. So we've made it easy. Just scroll down, click right on it, and you'll be able to connect with Nick. Dude, thanks again for your time, and I'm looking forward to the next one.
Yeah, thanks, Chad. This was great.
Yep, no problem. See you later, everybody.
Peace.
Yay!
Westport.